All right, well, welcome everyone. We're glad to have you. We're gonna go and jump right in, and let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, and let's talk about influencer intelligence. So what we want to focus in on today is being able to use social network analysis and apply that in change situations so we can understand the large group of stakeholders that we would have, and then be able to really understand out of that group of stakeholders who are the particular influencers. And so we're going to take this on as an analytical exercise to be able to help us figure out who those folks are. All right, so this question, why study social network analysis? Maybe the last 12 months, there's never been a time to think about this kind of idea of social network analysis than potentially ever before. We're in the midst of watching two pretty incredible events. So one of them is this worldwide pandemic, and understanding how a pandemic is transmitted is done through social network analysis. So if you're an immunologist and you're trying to understand the transmission vector for any particular disease, it's these techniques that are going to be used in order to understand that. And we won't get into all of them in just a little bit of time that we have, but you'll get a taste for what it looks like and how you can use some of these tools to understand that. And in addition to that, the incredible impact that we've had, certainly we saw it last summer, but it continues with using social networks to be able to organize people for what has been just amazingly significant protests that occurred certainly starting in the summer, but have continued after then, and being able to marshal people together using that kind of tool, and understanding that tool can be done through social network analysis. So that's what we're going to be getting into today, is understanding how to take that and apply it in a change initiative. So this is part of a series of webinars that we've been doing. And so we have these 8 webinars, and the ones on the left are the change analytics related webinars. We'll be doing those in the second week of every month and rotating them as we go throughout the year. So we'll do these 4 in rotation. And then with them, in the 4th week of each month, we'll be doing a change of leadership and joy at work, or joy at work webinar as well. So we've talked about research last month, and we'll be talking about stakeholder impacts later this month, and you see some of the other things that we've got coming in the next few months, and again, be rotating those as well and updating them as we continue to do the research work that we're doing around all of these topics. So we're glad to have you guys here, but wanted to let you know that there'll be others coming as well. All right, so let's jump into some of what is going on with social network analysis. So I like this definition because I think it's straightforward enough, but grounded enough to be useful. So social network analysis is the process of investigating social structures through the use of networks and graph theory. And so the networks and graph theory part is the underlying mathematics that helps us to understand what's going on here. And we'll touch a bit on some of that, but not too far, right? We can understand quite a bit about social networks just conceptually without having to go into significant levels of math. But we're gonna look at using these tools to characterize, so understand, if you like that word better, a network structure in terms of nodes, so in our case, people, stakeholders, and their ties, which are going to be their relationships or how the people are interacting with each other. So why even bother to do that for change management is, I think, a useful question. So these 3 areas seem to be useful to contemplate as we're putting all of this together. So social perceptions, so how people perceive what is going on around them, often happens through their social structures, and humans, as I'm sure you are not surprised to know, tend to gravitate towards people who are similar to them. And so network structures tend to wrap around some measure of similarity, and we can see that when mapping out structures, and I'll give you an example of that as we go through. And then social influence, so the information itself tends to flow to like-minded groups, because like-minded groups are where the connections are occurring within the social network. And so that's going to be important in understanding what's happening within our change, because that's where the influence is going to be. And then lastly, social capital. As again, I'm sure many of you, all of you have experienced, people tend to flock to things that are successful and tend to move away or distance themselves from things that are not so successful. And so change is going to be a significant driver of that. And so paying attention to what goes on within the social network structure is going to be important for understanding what happens there. All right, so what I want to do is I want to use this simple network setup as a way to just talk about the components of a social network and then how to go about analyzing it. And so we just have these 10 people, and you can see that they're relatively loosely strung together. And we're going to look at things like strong ties, which are represented by the solid lines. And strong ties are useful to understand because there's going to be reinforcing messages as a result of them. That's certainly what we've seen with behavior on social network media. And that's certainly true in in-person networks or any other kind of network as well. And then weak ties could be a source of leverage. In this case, the ones that are in the dotted lines, because there's the opportunity for you as a person trying to lead or guide through a change initiative to be able to create a different sort of perception that's happening, because there isn't one potentially that's already in there and flourishing. So a different opportunity for you to have an influence. And then lastly, no tie or absent ties, and so no connection. And we might think about actually creating one. So explicitly doing activities that bring people together and help make the connection so that you can use that social network structure to help along the change initiative. So now taking the same network and want to think about how do we look at it both graphically, so the picture that we have. And so I've added in letters for all of the people so that we have the indication of who they all are. And then we're going to look at it analytically. And so I'm going to convert the information that's graphical into this analytical table, a matrix. And so the people are going to be listed across the top and down the left side. And in graph theory, they're referred to as vertices or nodes. They're humans for us. And the edges are measured inside the graph numerically. So we're just getting a value for how strong the tie is. And so to keep it simple, I made 10 a strong tie, 3 a weak tie, and 0 would be the absence of a tie. And so we can take the information that we see graphically on the left and make it analytical on the right. And you can almost immediately see the value of having both of these, right? So if I gave you a table with a whole bunch of numbers in it and asked you, hey, tell me what this looks like, that would be hard to do. I mean, it would take you do it, you'd be able to figure it out, but it would take you a while to kind of sort through and get even close to the picture that we see on the left. But by drawing that picture on the left, within a few seconds, you know a lot about what is going on with that network. But graphically, it's not really all that easy to go analyze it and try and understand. And so the balance of the two is really helpful for us to be able to understand what's going on. So the way in which we would read this analytically, if we wanted to understand the connection between person E and person D, we would read across from the E line, read down from the D line, and then we see that there's a strength of 10. And you can see that in the very center of the diagram, there's a strong tie, solid line that is depicting the connection between the two. All right, so let's just go and use this and do a little bit of analysis and try and understand a bit more about what's going on with these group of 10 people. So a way to go about doing that is, again, staying with the same matrix. In this case, I grayed out all the zeros just to make the parts where there's true data pop more for us. And I'm going to look at this idea of degree centrality, which is just a measure of the number of connections that a person has. And there's two things that we can do with that. One is we can just add them up. So we just go down the columns and add up how many connections we have. And so that's the first line. And then we can sum up the strength of those connections, and that's the second line. And you can quickly see a bunch about what's going on within this network structure as a result of that. So person G has got the most connections, and so maybe not too surprisingly, person G also has the greatest strength of connection. Doesn't necessarily have to be like that, but they're going to tend to move with each other. But if you look, we have a lot of people that only have 2 connections, and they range, the strength of those connections range pretty broadly. So from as low as 6 to as high as 20. So these 2 measures are useful and somewhat independent of each other and giving us different pieces of information about what is really going on with this particular network. And so we can see where there's lots of connections, and we can see where there are relatively few or loose connections. And so degree centrality is a quick way to kind of understand that. But going a little bit deeper on this, the connection strength doesn't necessarily have to be the same in both directions, meaning how I think about my connection to you does not need to be the same of how you think about your connection to me. So it can be asymmetric, and that can be kind of illuminating when you're trying to understand what's going on with the network. And so what we do is we talk about in degree and out degree. So in degree is the number of connections that are directed into a node, so into a person in our case. Out degree are the ones coming out from a person. So if you're thinking about it like Twitter, in degree would be the number of people who are following your Twitter account, and out degree would be the number of Twitter accounts that you are following. In a change context, we might think of in degree as a measure of influence or maybe even popularity. Out degree might be a measure of how sociable somebody is or how much of an extrovert they are, which might be really helpful for understanding how information flows in your organization. And that's what we're trying to get after here, is to understand where the information is flowing, where the influence is amongst the stakeholders within the network. So another layer down, in some ways the next layer down, is this idea of closeness centrality. And that's going to be the total distance of any one node from all of the other nodes. So to take an example here, I'm starting with person F, we'll call her Frida. I would look at how far is Frida from every other person. So how many hops do you need to go to get to all of the other people, and then just average that and calculate what is the average distance that is going to be there. You likely know this idea from the notion of 6 degrees of freedom. So you may have heard that everybody in the United States is no more than 6 connections away from everybody else. And where that came from was actually a social psychology experiment back in the 50s, where they literally sent out letters, asked people to forward those letters, and then averaged how long it took for those letters, the follow-on letters, to reach certain people. And the average was 6. So it's a 6 degrees of freedom idea. In the 90s, there was this 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So those of you who are old enough to remember that may have heard about how connected we all are to Kevin Bacon. Those experiments have been repeated now with social media, and the connection's like 3.2 on average now. So as a country, we've become more connected together through our social networks than we ever were through our personal networks. I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's a fact of how this has all come together. And then the last one I wanted to talk to you about is this idea of betweenness centrality. You can think of this as who are the people who are the bridges between other people. And in this particular network, we have some fairly significant people. So persons D, E, and F are the bridge between the 2 groups that we have, one on the left and one on the right. If one of those people were to leave, then this single network would break into 2 networks. They would be disconnected and no longer able to pass information back and forth. And so persons D, E, and F have an interesting place in the network. And understanding that may be an impetus for you to try and drive a change. So if you look at how these change, and it's not just the betweenness centrality, but the closeness centrality, if I add in 2 connections, so these two that are now in the orange, the tightness of this network increases dramatically. And even if a person leaves, I'm still going to have a connection throughout the entire network. It gets thinner, but it's still connected, whereas before that was not true. And so that might be an impetus to look at, well, maybe I want to work at connecting 2 or 3 or 4 disparate groups and figure out ways to bring them together and use some techniques to explicitly do that, because that may benefit the change initiative that you have. Maybe not every time, but it's something certainly to consider. And going through a process of using this kind of a analysis to understand that can be very helpful. All right, so here are 4. We have the in degree and out degree, measuring the numbers of connections both going in and out. Closeness, centrality, betweenness, centrality give us a little bit more of an indicator of how any particular person is within the entire network. So how much of a connector they are and how far away they are from all of the others in the network. And so if we were able to understand these and hopefully understand them relatively easily, that can be really beneficial for us. So that is kind of the goal of, or at least an initial goal of doing some social network analysis on our stakeholder group, because we want to find those particular people who are going to be the influencers. So I want to do a little bit of a demo for you in a tool, and I'm going to use this tool, NodeXL, which is a Microsoft Excel template. So it sits on top of Microsoft Excel. As you can see, they have a free version, which is why I'm using this thing. I use this in the classes that I teach at the University of Richmond. So I teach analytics classes in the business school. And I use this, again, partly because it's free, and then also partly because it's pretty easy to use. You can see that there are paid versions. I've never used a paid version. I am not associated with the Social Media Research Foundation. So if you use those, great. I don't get anything out of it. But I think, as you'll see, the free version's actually got a lot of functionality to it. So I think you'll find that's certainly useful enough to start off with, and a worthy thing to kind of jump in with. All right, so I want to use just a bit of an example. So let me set the scene for you. The company that we're going to try and analyze is called Leadership Skyward, and they are an aviation leadership experience company. What they do is they bring executives together for 2- and 3-day retreats to talk about communication and decision-making as it's done in the cockpit. And so learn from how pilots do it so that those executives can take those skills back with them. What's interesting about them is they take the executives flying so that they actually practice those skills in the aircraft and get the experience of being in a very different environment and then having to exercise those skills.
Yeah, and you notice Ed is talking about it like it's a real company, because this is the company that he really wants. Just
someday you'll see Leadership Skyward Incorporated.
He'll be talking about it. You're like, wait, is this a real company?
I'm just going to keep
in his mind
wishing it into existence.
Exactly.
And it's used in some of your classes too.
Right, exactly. Right. Welcome back, Scott.
Exactly.
To the Leadership Skyward leadership team.
That's right. Scott's participated in one of our classes and has played some significant roles at Leadership Skyward. So he knows what it's like to be an executive there. All right. So I'm going to pop out of the PowerPoint, and I'm going to take you guys over to Excel. And I'm first going to start with an input sheet. So the first part of this is how do you get the data? So I just want to kind of show you an example. So I use this very same technique in my classes. So I've done this a bunch of times now, and it is pretty straightforward. So what I'm doing is I put all the names running down the left-hand side, and then the same names running across on the top. And when I give it to my students, I ask them to go find their name, and then I give them a small little rubric of what 10 means, 5 means, 1 means, and 0 means, and then ask them to rate how connected they are to every other student in the class. And then I anonymize the data because I don't want to freak anybody out. But then I actually use that data to talk through the social network analysis part of the class, and so they can actually see how connected they are to the class. I also use that when I'm making up teams for projects within the class, because I'm explicitly trying to help them to become better connected. And so I'll connect them together with other students that they don't know very well, as well as I'm trying to mix together the math phobes and the super analysts, so that we don't have all the math phobes in one group and all the super analysts in another group. So it helps me to be able to do both of those things by laying it out. But what I think is useful here is that they can fill this out in like 2 minutes or less, right? It's an easy exercise to go in and go 0, I don't know that person; 1, I barely know them; and 10, I see them every single day and talk with them every single day, and the whole range that's in between. You can use the same thing, same technique. And what you want to measure is whatever is going to be important for you within this change context. So a couple examples, like if you're putting in a new system, you might ask, how likely are you to go to these various people to get help with understanding how to do your job? And you may find who are the people that, for whatever reason, everyone else gravitates to ask for help on how they do their job. Maybe they're working in a call center. How do I answer a customer's complaint or a customer's problem? Who are the people you go to when something's kind of tricky? Those might be the people that you want to find, because they're going to be influencers, and be able to get a hold of them and engage them in a different way to be able to have an influence on the change that you're putting together. You may also just want to ask about how often they're communicating. Maybe you just want to know about how much information is flowing. So you can ask any question. And the trick is to give them an easy to use scale. I use 0 to 10, 0 meaning nothing at all, 10 being whatever the highest is, but give some sort of a verbal description about what you mean at 1 and at 5 and at 10. And people tend to be able to figure out pretty accurately and with consistency all the values that are in between, at least good enough to do an analysis that's going to help out. So the first thing we do is we're going to build this thing, and this becomes an upload matrix into NodeXL. And it's pretty easy to do the upload. However, I'm not going to do it because my computer runs super slow when I do it while I'm also running Zoom, and I'm not making that mistake again. So I'm skipping ahead, and just trust me that it was relatively quick to do. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. And always happy to connect with anybody to show them later what that would be, so you can see it, and if you have any trouble being able to put that together. All right, so now we're coming back in, and as you can see, we're just in an Excel spreadsheet, but I've got this NodeXL tab here as well. And that tab has specific elements that are on it that come when I download the free version of NodeXL. And they have very easy instructions on how to go put that together. If that's what you want to go do. On the left-hand side, what you are seeing is the data inputted into NodeXL. And so right now we're on the vertices tab, which means we're talking about the connections. So 2 people for all the people that are connected. And what I've done is I've gone in and I've used some of the functionality in NodeXL to mark some of the people. So mark some of the different groups. So this is, we're talking about an aviation company. Some of these groups are in here are the pilots. Some are the maintenance people that keep the aircraft up and running. Some are the operations people. So I can lay out the different groups and either use a different shape or a different color to know who all those people are. So it kind of helps me to differentiate. And then on the right, as you can see, it's mapping the network. And there are a number of different ways to do it. I like to start with the circle because it's relatively easy to pick up and understand. So if I start, I'll make this a little bigger. So I'm looking at this kind of circular setup, and I can see a couple of things right away. I mean, it looks like there are generally 2 groupings of people, right? So we have this one grouping of people in the upper left, and then we have this other grouping of people in the bottom right. And then you can see there's some light connections that are occurring between them, but that's it. So that's one thing I know right away. Like there's definitely some separation within this organization. And so I probably want to look at 2 things. So one is, what are the groups that make up those 2 groupings? And then 2, where are the connections? Because those connections might be pretty important. Even though these things are relatively light, you can see the light lines in here. they're going to be important for making the connection. The only really heavy connection I have is over here. And one of the interesting things you can do is click on that, highlight the person and all their connections, so that I could go in here and figure out by looking at the data that's in here, who that is. So who is the person that we're paying attention to, or we want to pay attention to here, who's actually got all the connections that we're going to want to look at, because they are going to be important for what we're trying to do to understand what's going on in this network. So the other setups that are here, or algorithms that are used to highlight what's going on, might be a little bit more useful. So let's take a look at a couple of those just so you can see how things break out. So if I look at this Fruchterman-Reingold one, the algorithm is trying to pull apart the network as much as possible. And what I get out of that is I can see actually some subgroups start to show up, and where there's some stronger connections. So I still have these groups over here, but there is this clearly a mesh of people that are much more tightly connected. So again, clicking into those and finding who are some of the people at the center of these might be useful, because those folks having the most connections are going to be most influential. I'm doing this all graphically right now. I'm going to show you how to do it analytically as well. And then the last one, the Harold Corin one, is maybe the most useful here, because it does the best job of really separating into groups. And so here I see, I really have more like 3 groups of people as I really start to separate it out. Now there's enough connections in here that the previous algorithms brought these 2 groupings together. But you can probably look at this as 3 groupings. And if you look more deeply inside, you'll notice that the colors are largely clustered by those. Maybe not so surprising, because I made the colors based on the groups of people and where they work. And so you can start to see more of what's going on in here. And then if I can look at this a little more analytically, and so I'll slide over now to looking at the edges that we've got, and being able to now drive, on the vertice one, drive over to look at some of the things that we were talking about. So here's the calculation for in degree and out degree, betweenness centrality, and the closeness centrality. And I can use just some basic functions in Excel to sort them, these little drop downs, and just sort these numbers from largest to smallest. And I can see as a result of that who has the most connections going in, and how they match for the person that's going out, and just make some real easy analytical views of that. If I'm more interested, and I probably should be, with betweenness centrality, because we saw that we've got these pretty segregated groups, these first 10 or so people that we have here are going to be the ones that have the most connections. So I might start paying attention to this group in a different way than I would others. Maybe I want to include them as part of an ambassador group that I would use for any change that I was going to take on with this organization, because they are clearly the ones doing most of the connecting with everyone else. Now, in a small group like this, you might be able to figure that out by doing a few interviews. So I'm not saying you can't do that, you can. But as the groups get bigger, as I'm sure you know, that gets harder to do. So it's going to take more and more interviews to do that. If you could ask people to take just a couple of minutes, less than 5, to fill out a survey like this, and then use an analytical tool to be able to get in there and really understand what's going on, I think that could be a way for you to get some insights relatively quickly and ask relatively little of the people that you're impacting as a result of doing that. All right, so I'm going to stop with this, and what I want to do is come back to our slides, back to Leadership Skyward, mostly because who doesn't want to look at airplane pictures? Everyone does, of course. So I give you one more shot of that, and then I want to ask Roxanne to talk a little bit about how this links into the work that she's done as a change practitioner.
Yeah, so as change experts yourselves, you understand what I'm going to talk about just briefly, which is stakeholder analysis. So what we would suggest is probably something you would do anyway, which is you're taking those influencers that you identified and doing a stakeholder analysis just for them to try to understand, what is their interest in the change and how might you categorize their influence, and then based on that, how you might involve them in the change process. So as an really basic example, if you have audit is part of a project, and really their influence is they can shut it down if they find out that you're not compliant. They're the type of influencer that just needs to be informed. You got to keep them informed because you don't want to be surprised by them, but they're not going to be involved. Whereas if you have other influencers that are more directly or part of the group that's directly impacted, perhaps it would be better to involve them in a deeper way so that the people they represent feel that their voice is being heard, their perspective is being considered as the change progresses. So this is the process, the very basic process that we advocate for. And if you're part of our classes, this will look familiar. So, yeah.
Great, thanks. All right, so that's the end of the stuff that I wanted to show. I just wanted to share with you briefly ways to get in touch with us. So maybe the most interesting is towards the bottom on the left there that Roxanne and I are writing about what we're finding with some of the work that we're doing and putting it out in a medium. It's on our website as well on the blog, so you can find it in either place. I will say though that we do get as much as 2 or 3 pennies every time you read an article on Medium. And I got a whole $23.72 last year, so I'm pretty excited about that.
23 cents last month for me.
That's right. So we're rolling through the money here, as you can see, as authors. But we are putting that stuff out, trying to share what it is that we're learning, both through this work as well as some of the research we're doing, which I'll tell you about here in just a second. We do have this change analytics concentration that we have now done a couple of times and have coming up again in March. And what we're doing with this is going more in depth, certainly than what we talked about today in the social network analysis #1, but then getting into how to use surveys and have those be analytically significant, as well as get people to actually take them, and then get more into change metrics. And then finally, how do we go about making a presentation out of all of that that's really going to be persuasive. So if you guys are interested in that, you can check that out on our website as well and see what's going on there.
It's the class I always wanted to take and just didn't exist as far as I could tell. So we're really proud of it. We're excited about it.
Yeah, it's a nice intersection between the analytical background that I have and the change background Roxanne has, and the analytical stuff she's done and the change things I've learned. We try to mesh all that together between all of these. We're also these other workshops that we do. You see the change analytics on the right, but we also have a change practitioner course that we are a qualified education provider through ACNP. So we've done that course a few times, as well as the Savvy Change Leaders series that Scott has been through, and now a whole bunch of other people as well that we're running in parallel, so concurrently actually, with our Change and Joy course, so that we have organizational leaders and change practitioners together, which we think is kind of cool. And that's set up to be done virtually. And then last, I've mentioned this a couple of times, we're doing research around this idea of joy at work. And so one of the webinars that we're doing is to share those findings, and we're writing pretty considerably about those findings as well. And the idea is to understand how does change impact culture, and the way in which we're thinking about culture is this idea of the level of joy at work everyone has. So, which I would love to talk about for like 3 more hours, but we don't have time to do that. But if you guys have questions about that or any of the other stuff that we've talked about, we would love to take any of those. So thank you.
And I just want to mention one thing. So we have an Instagram account called Joy at Worker, and we post there almost every weekday. So if you like to take in your information in a more visual medium, we're active in our account there. And then also wanted to mention, if you want, we have this takeaway that we can send to you if you're interested, which is the Excel node.
Yeah, so I have a NodeXL how-to guide. So if you guys are interested in that, I'm happy to share it with you. It's something I use in my class, so I feel like it's pretty battle tested now because clueless 20-year-olds have been able to use it. So I'm sure you guys will be okay. So if you're interested in that, you can just send us an email at joy@thechange decision, or just pop something in the chat if you'd like as well, and we're happy to send it to you. All right, so that's all we had to share. So we'd love to stop here and see what thoughts and questions you guys have. And I know we said this was a webinar, but as you can see, it's actually a Zoom meeting. So you can just come off mute and ask your question, or you can throw it in the chat if you prefer to do that. Nothing? Everybody's got everything they ever wanted to know. It's all in there.
I have a question about, well, first of all, sorry, thank you. That was very interesting. I have to admit, what you're talking about is sort of on the peripheries of where I would engage with change. So I don't know a great deal about the social network theory, but I'm really curious about what kind of response you get from the people that you ask to self-judge in terms of their connections, or does somebody on the change team somehow make judgments on other people's behalves? I'm just really curious as to what kind of quality of data you get to put into that.
Yeah, I don't think it works all that well if you're asking somebody else to do the evaluation. I mean, you can learn some from it, so it's not unuseful, but better to get the data directly from each of the individuals themselves. And I think the context of explaining to them or giving them the context, hey, why am I doing this?
Right.
And then even more so to what you're going to do with it. Like this information is going to be anonymous, not going to publish anybody's name. It's not going to go anywhere else. Now they have to believe you, and I know that can be a problem as well, that you're going to do it. But that seems to be a really useful way to go about doing it, and it sets people up with the right understanding of how you're going to use that data, and so tend to have people that will be more willing to jump in and engage that way.
I am curious in terms of, you say you tell them how you're going to use it. One of your examples was, you might have somebody that people go to frequently for, say, help on a telesales floor or something. One of the perennial leadership challenges is you often get one or two or three people, depending on the team or the organization, who everyone goes to for particular topics or issues. It might be certain knowledge or capability or something else. And that's actually a problem. So I can anticipate, and this is kind of what was going through my mind, is that if that person is approached by somebody saying, fill in this form, tell us how well connected you are, and we're going to use it to create sort of advocates for our change program, have you experienced sort of resistance from people thinking, oh my God, more workload, more people coming to me? Because that's a classic change resistance position that I've seen and experienced, a handful of times. So
yeah, so I would say that it really just does depend on their level of interest in it. You're absolutely right. Even they may not be interested. And you have to make the judgment call about that, about how are we going to mitigate that situation? And it may be that you can find light ways for them to be involved, or maybe find proxies that can work on their behalf. So I think there are lots of ways that you can mitigate that, because I agree, you don't want to you don't want someone on a network that's not interested in being on the network. That's the opposite of the spirit you're looking for.
Yeah, and actually the base of the question was, how well do you think they would fill in that data for you if they saw it as a potential threat? I think is that.
Yeah. I do think it's contextual. I mean, you have to understand what the risk is, as you're saying. If the risk is that they will think of it as something negative, you have to find a way to address that when you set up the context. That's the only thing I could think to
Yeah.
mitigate that.
And I think there's, so Roxanne has had great success in this too, in terms of, in some ways, appealing to people's, maybe it's a little bit of vanity, we need you, and we would appreciate your expertise, but also making it voluntary.
Right.
And even setting up some of these ambassador networks where people can walk in and walk out.
Right.
Like, so your work is getting overwhelming. We understand, right? You need to take care of that. Go ahead and step out. If you can step back in a few weeks or a few months, depending on how long this thing is going on, great. And so that tends to be a nice mitigator for people, because they're not signing up for a commitment that maybe goes on longer than they're willing to take that commitment on. And so instead of providing what could be great advice and resource for a few months, they don't do anything because they're worried about being overcommitted. And so providing them an out can be useful with that as well.
Yeah, and we've had a bad situation in the past where people were voluntold to be part of a network, and we didn't realize that was happening until we started to notice some bad behavior or just some lack of engagement, as an example. And so we had to take some steps to shift that, because it wasn't going to actually do what we needed them to do. It wasn't going to be effective. So
yeah, I think that's the kind of the I suppose it's the manipulative angle of may have been unintended, but it's the sort of give me this data and then I'm going to do something to you. It's that sort of overcoming that barrier.
Yeah, I really do think it's explaining the spirit of what's going to happen, but then you also have to demonstrate it. I mean, people are going to be slow to trust in some cases, totally get that. And then oftentimes we might just say, well, could you just try it with us for a little bit and you can step out if it's just too much for you. So it's just another way.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Eva.
Yeah. Real
That's a real world
problems.
kind of real world problem right there. What else, folks? Any other questions? We got like a minute or two left before our time is up.
Ed and Roxanne, thanks for putting this on. Very, very interesting stuff. I'm thinking of an application where I might have way more than 25 people to consider, and way less knowledge about the interactions and relationships between all of those people. So I guess sort of rule of thumb guidance on, can you do something with that large a population and potentially with more like a 3 or a 5-point scale on how well people are connected?
Well, in terms of the scale thing, Scott, I continue to be frustrated whenever I try and use a 5-point scale and everybody gives me answers on a 10-point scale anyway. So, they'll give you a 3.5 or 2.7. So I'm like, okay, I'll just make it 10. And
Yeah.
what I do think is useful about 10, and I've looked up some of the literature and it's a little all over the place. So it's hard to know for sure if there's anything rigid about this, is that there's enough of a spread that people can get to actually use the entire scale. Whereas if you go to 5, people tend to cluster more.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't always true. Technically, I don't think you're going to get necessarily a different answer that way. In terms of like, what do you do about a group that gets bigger and bigger? Yeah, at some point, you're not going to be able to ask somebody, I want you to judge 100 other people and tell me how you know them. You're going to get a lot of zeros out of that. So I think you want to get to what do you need to know, right? So if there are 5 groups of 20 each, and what we really need to understand is what's going on in each of the groups of 20, then ask the question at each of the groups of 20 people, not the entire division of 100 or 1,000, because that may not actually be all that useful for you. And if really what is more useful is to understand groups themselves, you could ask the question of the leaders of the group instead of all of the people. So how does accounting work with marketing? How does marketing work with advertising? And set it up more like that, instead of going to every single human within a large organization and asking them to make that judgment, because you'll get a very poor response rate, right? I think people are gonna
Right.
are going to just dump you from there.
Yeah, and the other thing too, Scott, is you could focus in on the people that are you're most concerned about, right? And that way, and those could be the people who are directly impacted, or the people you expect are going to have the biggest reaction.
Yeah.
There could be some groups where you're just going to, okay, well, we're going to focus here for now and see what we can learn.
Yep.
It's good. It's a good question. Diana, I saw you pop off for a second. Did you have something you want to ask?
I did, thank you. I was going to follow on to the question that was asked earlier about using this to identify ambassadors. And my question is, if you wanted to get at more themes, right? So you talked a little bit about people who are impacted in similar ways, or people who interact with different functions. I wanted to see if you could talk about any work you've done or what you've seen where this is applied maybe at a higher level than the individual connections, and really getting that common common impact or commonality with others that could form the basis for a network. So I wanted to see if you could just talk a little bit about that, or is that a whole different topic?
Well, I think that probably shows up more, maybe good enough, and Roxanne could talk about this, in more of a stakeholder impact assessment and kind of an interview approach to it. So I don't know that you might not get that much more lift out of trying to do this kind of quantitative approach. I think the value of this is you get a whole bunch of little pieces of data, you're able to stick them together and see the picture. I think what you do when you're doing a stakeholder analysis and doing the interviews for people may get more at what you're talking about, Diana. I don't know that you're going to get that much lift out of trying to do it analytically, because I don't know that you'll be any smarter than doing what you probably already do, which is go talk to people and ask them the questions about how are they connected and what is the influences there.
Yeah, it's probably your experience too, I'd imagine. When I start to hear repeat themes, then I know, okay, I'm kind of done now.
Well, and the reason I'm asking it, and what struck me at the very beginning, you mentioned in place of surveys, you could do this. And as we know right now, people are in survey fatigue.
Yeah.
So I was thinking this could be another way to capture feedback that isn't as intensive from a time standpoint.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So
and
that's how I was thinking about it.
We have done it at the leader, can do it at the leader level. So ask for people that are leading components of the organization to talk about how their characterization of how their group connects to other groups. And so I think that does work. Now, there's bias that's associated with that. I'm the boss and my group is awesome and we're super friendly and great to everyone and we're hyper connected all over. And so you're going to get potentially a kind of rosy-ish view of that, right? But it is a easy way to do it, right? You would relatively quick. You're only asking them to spend a couple minutes on it, and that means that you're not having. And you can tell them this too. As a result of you doing this 2 minutes, I don't need to go ask your team to do something, and so this is much faster. And you can get a response rate that way. But there's definitely a bias issue in there when you do it that way.
You're reminding me of how we think about metrics, how we look at things that are not survey and self-reported related. And we have a webinar coming up on that next time in March.
Yeah, in
March that
talk
would
about
be
the metrics
useful
part of that.
Because we'll talk about that because we agree that's always been the problem, right? Surveys, how do you make sure that you are treating people the way you would expect others to be treated by how you use surveys as an example. So surveys is always a problem. So how do you glean things without surveying, right? And surveying isn't enough anyway, at least that's how we feel about it. So we share that we'll share more about that in the metrics webinar.
Okay, that sounds great. Do you mind putting in the chat when that is, if you guys?
Sure. When is that?
It'll be the second Thursday of the month, whatever that is.
Okay.
In March.
you.
But I can send you a note on that, Diana, no problem.
Okay.
Other questions? All right.
All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for taking some time to hang out with us and talk about this. We're obviously interested, so we appreciate your questions and appreciate your connection. And if the NodeXL guide or something else that we talked about is interesting, just send us a note and we'll be happy to send it to you. All right. Have a good day.
Thanks all.